If there's one topic I can't seem to escape, it's the biblical date of the Exodus. People bring it up with me all the time. They often hold their views on the topic passionately, and sadly from personal experience, some are happy to end friendships with those who hold a different view to theirs. What we're going to do in this video is show how there is no one biblical date for the Exodus. There are in fact quite a few. So let's get started. The passage most people start and finish with is 1 Kings 6 verse 1. It's pretty clear. In the 480th year, after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, he began to build the house of the Lord. Now, Solomon started building the temple in 966 BCE, so let's do some simple maths adding those 480 years. When we do that, we get a date of 1446 for the Exodus. That's it. Pretty easy to work out, right? Let's stick that date on a timeline. There it is. And that is where most people stop. However, we've been reading that passage as it's recorded in the Hebrew Masoretic text. The Septuagint is an ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint manuscripts we have are quite a lot older than the oldest Hebrew Masoretic manuscripts we've got, and in some places there are differences between the Hebrew and the Greek. What does the Septuagint say in 1 Kings 6 verse 1? And it came to pass in the 440th year after the departure of the children of Israel out of Egypt. That is a 40-year difference. If we do the maths, we end up with a different date of 1406 BCE. The thing is, this is just as biblical a date as we read in the Masoretic text, so let's stick it on our timeline. There we go. Okay, that's 2 biblical dates so far. Let's now go over to the New Testament and read Acts 13, verses 18 to 22. For about 40 years he put up with them in the wilderness. After he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance for about 450 years. After that he gave them judges until the time of the prophet Samuel. Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul, son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, who reigned for 40 years. When he had removed him, he made David their king. Okay, that's a fair bit of chronological information right there. Let's lay it out. 40 years in the wilderness, unspecified period of time conquering the land, 450 years living in their inheritance. After that period, the period of the judges, then 40 years reign of Saul, then the 40-year reign of David, which we get from a different passage, and then those 4 years into Solomon's reign when he began to build the temple. So when you add up those figures, we get 574 years between the beginning of the Exodus and the 4th year of Solomon's reign. And that is not including those periods that we're not given a duration for. So it's more than 574 years, but we'll stick with that figure for now. Math time. When you add up those dates, we get a new date for the Exodus of 1540 BCE. And that's quite different to the previous 2 biblical dates. So let's put it on our chart. And there we go. That's at the start of the late Bronze Age, the yellow section on the timeline. The Middle Bronze Age, highlighted in dark red, had only just closed. Okay, so that's 3 biblical dates we've got now, and counting. Next, let's take a look at the narrative time periods, that is, the chronological information embedded in the biblical narratives. You can see here lots of chronological data working back from the 4th year of Solomon's reign all the way back to the beginning of the Exodus. I've taken this list from James Hoffmeyer's paper entitled "What is the Biblical Date for the Exodus?" It doesn't factor in co-regencies and it doesn't factor in potentially overlapping periods, but it's accurate enough to make the point. And the point is this: the narrative time periods add up to around 630 years. When we add that up, that produces our 4th and final biblical date of the Exodus of 1596 BCE. Let's put that on our chart. What's clear here is that there's more than one biblical date, and but they're spread over a period of almost 200 years, and yet they're each as biblical as each other. Depending on your view of Scripture, that is a big problem. Maybe archaeological evidence can help us out. Let's take a look at two relevant discoveries, starting with supply cities. We read in Exodus 1 verse 11 that they built supply cities, Pithom and Rameses, for Pharaoh. A biblical Ramses is a site known today as Canaan, and its construction began in around 1270 BCE. If we put that on our chart, we'll see that it doesn't fit any of our biblical dates. It's not even close. The biblical dates have the Israelites leaving Egypt between around 130 to 320 years before they even started to build Ramses. This isn't adding up. Our second bit of archaeological evidence that we're going to take a swift look at is the population decline and explosion in Canaan. The archaeological evidence of what's known as the Israelite settlement in Canaan and the population explosion that went along with it never seems to get an airing when discussing the date of the Exodus, and yet it's amongst the most relevant bits of archaeological evidence to our topic that there is. Here's why. There's an undisputed and very clear pattern of settlement that happened in the Canaanite highlands starting in around 1200 BCE. That's the beginning of the Iron Age. At the end of the Middle Bronze Age, around 1550 BCE, there were 248 sites in the Canaanite highlands. Over the next 350 years, that number collapsed down to 29 at the end of the Late Bronze Age and beginning of Iron Age 1. You'd expect, based on any and all of the biblical dates, that there'd be a population explosion in Canaan during this period as the Israelites arrived and settled. But that is not what we see. We see population collapse. Very significantly, there is clear evidence of a population explosion in the region, starting at around the beginning of the Iron Age 1, so that by the end of Iron Age 1, there are 254 sites, and at the end of Iron Age 2, in 586 BCE, there were 520 sites. Using different models, different numbers of sites come out, but what's important is the pattern. Everyone agrees that at around 1200 BCE, an extensive program of settlement began across the Canaanite highlands. Here's a quote from the Oxford History of the Biblical World. This extraordinary increase in population in Iron 1 cannot be explained only by natural population growth. There must have been a major influx of people into the highlands in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE. So the Israelites emerged in Canaan in around 1200 BCE. Let's put those population figures on our chart. You can see the collapse from 248 sites in the Canaanite highlands at the end of the Middle Bronze to the low of 29 sites at the end of the Late Bronze, and then the population explosion over Iron 1 to 254 sites. From the perspective of dating the Exodus, the implication of this undisputed evidence should be clear. If the Israelites began to settle in Canaan around 1200 BCE, and if they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, then they can't have left Egypt until the early to mid 13th century, say sometime around 1260 BCE, to allow them a few years to conquer Canaan before settling it. Who those newcomers to the Canaanite highlands were and where they came from is a story for another time. The thing is, none of that fits with any of the biblical dates we've seen. The first and hopefully obvious conclusion from all this is that producing biblical chronologies, either in book form, like Ussher's Annals of the World, which by the way has a different date of the Exodus again, or in chart form, like the well-known Adam's chronological chart of history, is a fruitless exercise. The second obvious conclusion is this. Given that the scribes, who've been copying out the scriptures for literally hundreds and hundreds of years, didn't take any of the many opportunities they had to fix or massage the biblical dates of the Exodus so they lined up, shows this. The biblical scribes didn't care about chronological discrepancies. They weren't in the business of providing the raw data required to create chronological charts of biblical history. This shouldn't be a surprise. It wasn't their intention to write history. Scripture tells us what it thinks its purpose is. All Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for history, for genealogy, and for training in precision, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for producing chronological charts. Sorry, 1 second. All scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work. That is what scripture is for. How about a passage specifically on the purpose of biblical history? For whatever was written in former days was written for our history education, so that by debating and by the misuse of scripture we might produce chronological charts. Sorry, I've done it again. 1 second. Whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the scriptures we might have hope. There's nothing there that says anything about using scripture to produce accurate historical chronologies. These passages very clearly teach that the purpose of scripture is to encourage, to teach righteousness, not to produce chronological charts. Now, that's not to say that scripture is garbage from a history point of view. As Sommer explains, contrary to what one sometimes reads in the popular press or hears from less learned pulpits, there are no archaeological or historical reasons to doubt the core elements of the Bible's presentation of Israel's history, namely, that the ancestors of the Israelites included an important group who came from Mesopotamia, and that at least some Israelites were enslaved to Egyptians and were surprisingly rescued from Egyptian bondage, that they settled down in the hill country of the land of Canaan at the beginning of the Iron Age, etc. So, this video hasn't been so much about whether there was an Exodus or not, and for what it's worth, I think there was. It's about whether the biblical writers were concerned with chronological accuracy. It seems to me that the evidence is clear. Scripture is concerned with its narratives, not precise chronologies. So, let's not mishandle the scriptures by trying to make the events they describe fit into a neat and tidy chronological chart. They were never intended for that purpose, and they'll defeat you if you try. So, our conclusion. There is no one biblical date of the Exodus.